I should have turned around the second I heard it. Not because it was loud, not because it was shocking, but because it was so familiar, like a bruise being pressed again. A memory I thought had healed whispering back into my ears. Don't worry, Jake. He'll sign it. He always does. That voice, Dad's, calm and confident, like it was already settled. I hadn't even stepped inside the house yet. 6 hours on the road, snow swirling against my windshield like white noise, the GPS blinking red as the signal flickered through the mountains. I thought I was coming home to warmth, to laughter, to the kind of Christmas movies lie about. But I was wrong. So deeply, painfully wrong. The driveway was exactly how I remembered it, cracked pavement from years of frostbite, my old basketball hoop still leaning to one side. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the porch light. It was glowing, soft and golden, like a memory trying to lure me back in. For a second, I smiled. Maybe it really had changed. Maybe Mom had missed me. Maybe Jake had grown up. Maybe Dad, God help me, had softened. I grabbed the 2 bags from the passenger seat, one with the gifts I carefully wrapped in hotel rooms. Over the last few days, the other with an old photo album I'd found while cleaning out my apartment. I thought they'd like that. I thought it meant something. I walked slowly toward the door, already hearing faint voices inside. No footsteps rushing to greet me. No one checking if I'd made it through the storm, just that half-open door and the warm yellow light spilling out onto the snow like a trap. I didn't ring the bell. Something in me wanted to listen. I crept up the steps, careful not to let the wood creak, and that's when I heard it clearly. Don't worry, Jake. He'll sign it. He always does. My father's voice. Followed by Jake's laugh, low and smug. My heart didn't just sink. It shattered into pieces so sharp I felt them in my lungs. They didn't know I was here yet. They hadn't seen me. I should have walked away. I should have turned around. Gotten in my car and driven anywhere but here. But I didn't. I stepped inside like nothing happened. And that might have been my first mistake. The living room smelled like cinnamon and pine, the way Mom always liked it. The tree stood tall in the corner, ornaments exactly where they used to be, as if someone had frozen time. Jake looked up first. His smile just a little too tight. You made it, he said, arms half open like it was a favor I was doing them. Mom came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, trying too hard to look surprised. Sweetheart, she said, her voice laced with guilt she hoped I wouldn't notice. Dad walked in last, his expression unreadable. That's how he's always been. A wall, not a man. I nodded, pretending I didn't hear a thing. It's good to be home, I said, lying through my teeth. We sat down for dinner like nothing was wrong, like we were a normal family again. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, every dish placed perfectly like it was all rehearsed. But the tension sat between us like an extra guest at the table. I watched the way they avoided eye contact, how Jake barely spoke to me, how Dad only asked surface questions. How's the job? Still in Chicago? You dating anyone? I gave polite answers, careful not to dig too deep. Because I wasn't ready for the truth to explode. Not yet. I needed time to breathe, to process, to plan. So I smiled when I had to. I laughed when the jokes fell flat. And when dinner was over, I volunteered to do the dishes just so I could stand alone in the kitchen and collect myself. My hands trembled under the hot water. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger. What did they want me to sign? What was so important that they had to whisper about it before I even stepped through the door? I didn't ask, not yet, because I needed to know what I was dealing with first. Later that night, when everyone went to bed, I stayed up. I walked through the hall like a ghost, every step echoing against the silence of the house that raised me. I paused outside Dad's study. The door was locked, but I knew where he kept the key, still hidden behind the same loose baseboard near the stairs. Some things never change. I slipped inside. The room smelled of old books and secrets. The desk was neat, too neat, and I knew exactly which drawer to check. The folder was there, a thick stack of papers, neatly arranged, waiting for a signature. My signature, power of attorney, property transfer, bank account revisions. And at the bottom, a clause that required both beneficiaries' consent to finalize. The sale of the family business. Jake's name already signed, mine left blank. So that's why they wanted me here. Not for Christmas. Not for love, for leverage, for paperwork. For something I didn't even know I still had legal power over what they wanted to sell. My stomach turned. Every call, every message, every forced invitation. It was all strategy. I wasn't a son. I was an obstacle. I left the study and went back to my room, the same one I grew up in, still painted the same faded blue. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan slowly turning above me, and I thought about everything. The childhood memories that felt too far away now, the birthday parties I stopped being invited to, the silence after Mom stopped calling, the way Jake took over when I moved out, and now this. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the betrayal or the fact that deep down I had expected it. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Only one thought stayed with me. This Christmas wasn't about family, it was about signatures, and whether or not I was ready to stop being the obedient son who always said yes. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't so sure I would. I didn't say a word the next morning, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't ready for what would happen if I did. I woke up before everyone else, sat on the edge of the bed with my hands clenched tight and my thoughts racing. There was a tremble in my fingertips I hadn't felt since I left this house years ago, like the walls still remembered how small I used to feel inside them. I could hear the familiar clinks and clangs from the kitchen, mom making breakfast, trying to recreate a normal she'd already destroyed. Jake was laughing at something on his phone in the living room, his voice loud, too casual, like the signature they needed was just a matter of time, and Dad? He was in the backyard, whistling like it was any other morning, like he hadn't weaponized my trust for the sake of convenience. I took a long breath, walked downstairs, and greeted them like nothing was wrong. I poured myself coffee with hands that still shook and asked Jake how work was going. He muttered something about promotions. Mom asked if I wanted eggs. Dad walked in with the paper under his arm and kissed her on the cheek like a man who believed. In his own illusion, the house felt colder than it looked. It wasn't the weather. It was the way they looked at me, like they knew something I didn't, like I was the only one still playing catch-up in a game that had already been decided. I played along. I laughed when Jake cracked a joke, even though my throat felt tight. I complimented the tree, the decorations, the food, like a guest in my own childhood. But all the while, that folder haunted me. The one in Dad's study. The one that held my name and expected my obedience. After breakfast, they went about their day like a well-rehearsed play. Jake took a call outside, pacing the porch. Dad retreated to his study, but not for long, and Mom pretended to fold laundry in the living room while stealing glances at me like a child waiting for the trick to work. By the afternoon, I was exhausted from pretending. I needed answers. I needed time alone with the truth, so I waited. Waited until the house settled into that lazy late Christmas rhythm. Jake left for a quick drive. Mom disappeared upstairs for a nap, and Dad, like always, turned in early, his door clicking shut with finality. That was my cue. I moved like I had as a teenager, quiet, careful, invisible. The hallway felt longer than I remembered, like every step was trying to stop me. I paused outside the study, half hoping the door would be locked again. It wasn't. That was almost worse. It opened without a sound, and I slipped inside. The air was still, heavy with cologne and old paper. The desk stood at the far end, polished to a shine, a mockery of transparency. I sat down in his chair, reached for the drawer, and found the lock in place. But like before, it gave way with one firm tug, and there it was, the folder. Brown, unmarked, thick. My heart pounded as I opened it. The first page was titled Power of Attorney. My name printed neatly at the top, beneath it a signature line left blank. I flipped through the next few pages: property deeds, asset summaries, legal agreements, all structured to funnel everything: the house, the business, the retirement fund into Jake's name. Every document bore his signature. None of them were valid without mine. I was the legal co-beneficiary of everything Dad owned, a decision he'd made years ago when I was still his responsible one. Back when Jake was still trying to find himself and screwing up at every turn. Back when I was the son he trusted with the future. But somewhere along the way that changed, not because I failed but because I left, because I chose my own life over the one they laid out for me, because I stopped making myself available to clean up their mess. And now they wanted my signature like it was a formality. Like I owed them that. As if disappearing from their holiday photos had also erased my rights. But I remembered. I remembered when Dad pulled me aside after Mom's surgery and handed me those original papers, telling me I'd earned it, that I'd proven I could carry the family name. I remembered the business trips he took me on, the long talks about legacy, about responsibility. And I remembered how all of that vanished the second Jake decided to step up, as if loyalty could be measured in proximity, not sacrifice. I stared at those papers for what felt like an hour. My name printed so many times it stopped feeling like mine, each document silently begging me to play along, to not cause a scene, to let them pretend this was just what's best. I closed the folder. My hands were cold now. My heart, even colder. They didn't invite me home for love. They didn't miss me. They needed me. Needed the power I didn't know I still had. And they had planned everything: every smile, every meal, every carefully worded sentence to make sure I gave it to them, without a fight, without even realizing. I stood up slowly, the chair creaking behind me like a warning. I didn't put the folder back. I kept it, tucked it into my bag before slipping out the door and locking it. Behind me, I walked back to my room, past the family photos on the wall, each one a little more faded, a little less real. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the folder in my hands. I wasn't just holding paper. I was holding every lie they tried to dress as tradition, every manipulation they draped in the glitter of Christmas. I could hear laughter from downstairs. Jake was back. I heard Mom call my name. I didn't answer, because now I knew the truth, and the truth was simple. They hadn't asked me to come home. They'd summoned me, not as a son, but as a signature, and I was no longer sure if they deserved either. I didn't wait another day. The weight of that folder in my bag was heavier than anything I'd carried in years, not because of its size, but because of what it meant, what it exposed. The truth was no longer buried in suspicion or wrapped in polite conversation. It was printed, notarized, and signed behind my back. I sat at the kitchen table the next morning, early again, watching the frost melt off the windows while the house slowly came to life. My coffee went cold in my hands. My mind was already rehearsing what I needed to say, how I'd say it, whether I'd be calm or furious. But no rehearsal could prepare me for the way they looked at me when I finally spoke. I didn't ease into it. No small talk, no pretending, just one question, sharp and direct. When were you planning to tell me about the documents? Jake froze mid-bite. Mom dropped the spoon she was stirring, and Dad didn't even blink. That told me everything. Jake was the first to speak, casual as ever. What documents? He said with a smirk, like a bad poker player caught bluffing. I held up the folder and placed it on the table between us like a loaded weapon. Don't insult me, I said quietly. You've already signed everything. I've seen it. His smirk faded. Mom sat down slowly, her hands folding in her lap like she was preparing for a funeral. Dad leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes locked on mine without an ounce of shame. It's not what you think, Mom started, her voice soft, as if lowering the volume would change the weight of what they'd done. Then tell me, I replied, my voice rising. Tell me why I was brought here under the pretense of family. Of Christmas, just to be handed a pen and expected to sign away everything without a conversation. Dad finally spoke. We weren't trying to deceive you, he said. We just thought it would be easier if Jake handled things. You're busy. You live far. It's just simpler this way. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. That word, simpler. That's what they always said when they were about to cross a line. It was simpler to leave me out of decisions, simpler to give Jake second chances while I was expected to be perfect, simpler to pretend like love could be measured by convenience. You're not making things easier, I said, my voice trembling now. You're erasing me. You made me co-owner for a reason. You gave me power of attorney, and now you're trying to strip it from me because I'm not here every weekend pretending this family still functions. Jake stood up suddenly, pacing, like he couldn't sit still anymore. Why does it even matter to you? He snapped. You left. You didn't want any of this. You chose your life in the city, your job, your independence. You made it clear you were done with us. His words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because they were the version of the truth they had chosen to believe, the lie they built without me. I didn't leave because I didn't care, I said slowly. I left because I couldn't keep pretending I was okay in a house that only loved me when I was useful. Silence fell over the room. Mom wiped her eyes. Dad didn't move. Jake crossed his arms and stared at the floor, but I could see the flicker of guilt beneath the surface. I kept going. You didn't even ask me. You signed everything, made plans, called lawyers, set dates. You didn't think I deserved a seat at the table, just a signature. Dad finally spoke again, but softer now. We thought you'd understand. You've always been the reasonable one. No, I said, standing up. I've always been the silent one, the compliant one, the one you didn't think would ever say, no, that's not the same thing. Jake coughed. So what now? You're going to make this difficult? You're going to fight us on this? I looked at him and saw a stranger in my brother's skin, a man who had convinced himself that my absence meant entitlement, that just because I had distanced myself from the dysfunction, I had forfeited everything. I'm not making this difficult, I said. I'm finally telling the truth, and the truth is you don't get to erase me just because I stopped being convenient. Mom reached for my hand, her voice breaking. Sweetheart, it's just a formality. You're still part of the family. I pulled my hand away. No, I said, quietly but clearly. If I was still part of this family, you would have told me the truth, not use Christmas as bait to get my signature. No one had anything left to say. The room was still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I walked out of the kitchen without looking back. The snow outside was thick again, softening the world in white silence. I stood on the porch, breathing in the cold air, letting it sting my lungs, letting it remind me I was still alive, still grounded, still more than a signature. Behind me, the warmth of the house flickered through the window, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Maybe it never had. For the first time, I realized the truth wasn't just in that folder. It was in the years I spent second-guessing my worth. The birthdays forgotten. The favors expected. The love measured in how much I gave, not how much I was given. They didn't want me home. They wanted the final piece of a puzzle they built without me, but I wasn't going to complete it. Not this time, not again. I didn't slam the door when I left, I didn't have to. Some exits don't need volume, they just need silence, and that silence followed me all the way down the icy driveway into my car and across the small town roads I knew too well. I drove without looking back, the house shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror, and with it, every false memory I had tried to preserve. The streetlights flickered through the falling snow, the windshield wipers ticking like a slow metronome, counting down the seconds to something I couldn't yet name. I checked into a cheap hotel just off the highway, room 217, faded carpet, buzzing heater, and locked the door behind me like I was sealing myself off from everything that tried to erase me. I dropped my bag onto the bed, unzipped it, and pulled out the folder like it was still hot from the betrayal. I turned on the desk lamp, sat down, and opened it with hands that no longer trembled. This time, I wasn't afraid to look. I wasn't afraid to know. Page after page, I read line by line, clause by clause, legal jargon unraveling into something clearer with every minute. Control, transfer of assets, dissolution of shared ownership. It wasn't just a business handover. It was a quiet dismantling of everything I had ever been promised. But tucked deep inside, on page 26, I found it. A clause I hadn't expected. One my father probably forgot about, or didn't think I'd read closely enough to catch. The original business charter, amended before I left for Chicago. It named me as equal co-owner, with full veto rights. Nothing could be sold, reassigned, or dissolved without both signatures. Not even by the founder, not even by blood. And suddenly, the entire plan made sense. That's why I was here. Not for Christmas, not for family, but for that one final stroke of ink that would make their betrayal legal. And they thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I'd be too tired, too guilty, too eager to belong. They thought I'd fold like I always had, but they were wrong. I stayed up the rest of the night drafting my reply. Not emotional, not explosive, just clear, just final. I didn't owe them rage. I owed myself peace. When the sun began to rise behind the thick curtains, I sent the email. The subject line was simple. Regarding documents, the message even simpler. I have reviewed the contents. I will not sign away my future for the comfort of your lies. This matter is closed. I stared at the screen for a long time after I hit send, expecting relief, but what came was something sharper, deeper. Not sadness, not pride, just truth. And truth in its purest form doesn't comfort you. It changes you. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked at myself in the mirror. Same face, same tired eyes, but something had shifted. For the first time, I didn't look like someone waiting for permission to exist. That evening, as the snow thickened outside and the hotel lobby played soft, tinny Christmas music, there was a knock at my door. I didn't need to check the peephole. I already knew it was Jake. I opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock in place. He stood there in his long coat, red-eyed, pacing in place like he'd rehearsed this moment too many times. Open the door, he said, low and tense. We need to talk. I didn't move. We talked yesterday, I said. You didn't listen. He exhaled sharply, shoved his hands into his pockets. You're ruining everything. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. No, I said. You ruined it the moment you thought I was too weak to say no. He didn't respond to that. Just stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. And maybe he didn't. Maybe the brother he remembered, the one who always made peace, who always kept quiet, was gone. Maybe I left him behind the moment I chose to stand up for myself. Jake leaned in closer. Dad's furious. He says if you don't sign, he's cutting you out of the will completely. You'll get nothing. I raised an eyebrow. Then let him. At least then I'll know where I stand, and I won't have to spend another holiday pretending any of this is real. The silence between us stretched like wire, sharp and thin. We were just trying to protect the business, he finally said. Keep it in the family. I am family, I snapped. But you decided that meant obedience, not partnership. You didn't protect anything. You hijacked it. You lied. You manipulated. You used Christmas as camouflage. And you thought I'd be too desperate to see the difference. He looked away then, jaw clenched, a flicker of shame finally breaking through the arrogance. I didn't want it to go like this, he muttered. Neither did I replied. But here we are. He took a step back. So that's it. I nodded. That's it. I closed the door slowly, the final click of the lock echoing louder than anything he could have said. I stood there for a long time, forehead resting against the wood, letting the silence settle again, letting it become familiar. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was awake. I was done letting guilt guide my choices, done mistaking manipulation for love, done giving pieces of myself to people who only wanted my silence. The snow kept falling outside, thick and soft like a new beginning. trying to cover everything. I poured myself a cup of bad hotel coffee and sat by the window, watching the town I used to call home disappear beneath a white hush. Maybe they would never understand why I said no, maybe they'd spin their own version of the story for years, but it didn't matter. Because the only thing I had ever needed from them was respect. And if they couldn't offer that, they didn't deserve anything else from me. Not my signature, not my loyalty, not even my presence. For the first time, I hadn't played the role they wrote for me. I had written my own line, and that line was, no. I didn't go back the next day or the one after that. The snow kept falling, blanketing the roads and quieting the world outside. But inside that dim hotel room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. Not peace exactly. Peace is slow. It comes later if it comes at all. But this was something firmer, sharper. Like I had finally stepped out of a fog that had followed me since childhood. One carefully built by people who claimed they loved me while slowly writing me out of their story. I sat at the edge of the bed with the folder in my lap, not because I needed to read it again, but because I needed to decide what it represented. It wasn't just paperwork. It was a mirror. It showed me what my family thought of me, not as a person, not as a son, but as a final signature, a predictable yes, a silent endorsement. But I had said no, and that no was echoing louder than anything I had said in years. That morning, I met with a lawyer in town, a quiet man with sharp eyes who read everything. I brought with him in one sitting. When he looked up, he just nodded. "You're protected," he said. "They can't touch it without you." He asked what I wanted to do next. I told him without hesitation I wanted my share protected. Not for revenge, not to punish them, just to put my name back where they had tried to erase it. Within an hour, we filed the necessary papers, an official declaration securing my co-ownership, locking in my legal veto, and ensuring no assets could move without my clear consent. And when he slid the final page across the desk, I signed it firmly, cleanly. For the first time in this entire mess, I signed something that mattered, something for me. Afterwards, I didn't drive to the house. I drove to the edge of town, to the overlook where my mother used to take us as kids when things got too loud at home. The view was the same: snow-covered hills, tall pines dusted in white, and the quiet hum of wind pressing against the car. I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, and tried to feel something for them: anger, sadness, longing. But what came instead was release, like I had been carrying their weight for years, dragging it behind me like a shadow I didn't ask for. And now I had finally set it down. My phone buzzed twice that afternoon, once from Jake, once from Mom. I didn't answer either. I let their words sit in my inbox, unopened and unread, because I already knew what they'd say. "Come home. Let's talk. This isn't what we meant." But I also knew what they really meant. Fix it, undo it, be who we need again. And I couldn't do that. I wouldn't, because this time I had chosen me. Christmas morning came quietly. No wrapping paper, no forced smiles, no pretending. I sat alone down the street, sipping burnt coffee and listening to the buzz of strangers around me. A family sat across the room: parents, two little kids, one of them holding a snow globe, shaking it with wonder. I smiled, not because I envied them, but because I knew I'd never get that kind of family again. Maybe I never had it to begin with, and yet there was no bitterness in the realization, just truth, and with truth came freedom. I opened my laptop one last time and sent a final email, not to my parents, not to Jake, but to myself. It was a letter I started weeks ago and never finished. A letter I wrote after Thanksgiving when the loneliness crept in and I questioned whether I was wrong to stay away from them. In it, I had written every doubt, every ache, every plea for understanding. I deleted it, every line, and in its place I wrote 3 new sentences. "You are not a backup plan. You are not just a signature. You are not broken for saying no." I hit send to myself. Because some affirmations don't need to be shared, they just need to be believed. When I finally checked out of the hotel, I didn't drive back to Chicago right away. I drove through the back roads, first past my old school, the library where I used to hide during fights, the diner where I once dreamed of leaving. And as I passed each place, I didn't feel regret. I felt distance, not the kind you measure in miles, but the kind that shows you how far you've come inside, the kind that says you're not that person anymore. Before I hit the highway, I made one last stop. I mailed the original folder, the unsigned documents, back to my father. No note, no explanation, just the papers they had prepared for my surrender, returned without ceremony. Let them see what real silence feels like. As I merged onto the interstate, the snow finally began to clear. The clouds parted, revealing a soft winter sun above the gray horizon. My hands loosened on the wheel. My chest felt lighter. I didn't know what would come next, if they'd fight, if they'd beg, if they'd cut me off completely. But I knew what wouldn't come next. Me betraying myself to make them comfortable. That part of my story was over. Because sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is not return to what hurt you. even if it wears the mask of family. Sometimes the bravest choice is not forgiveness, not confrontation, but simply walking away. I didn't sign their future, I signed my own. And this time I signed it with my name in full, knowing exactly who I was.